everyone, and welcome to the Crisis and Critique, Philosophy and Its Other Scene podcast. My name is Frank Ruda. I'm here with my friend and collaborator, Agon Hamza, and we're happy to welcome you to this new episode with a very special guest, highly esteemed, and it's wonderful. I'm very excited that he's with us. But before we'll be introducing him. I just briefly wanted to mention that we would be enormously grateful if you could subscribe to our YouTube or Spotify channel, or if you like the work that we do, consider becoming a patron. So with us today is Adam Tooze. Adam holds the Shelby Cullum Davis Chair of History at Columbia University and serves as a director at the European Institute. After growing up in England and Germany, he did a BA in economics, King's College, Cambridge, where he also taught after the PhD from the LSE from 1996 to 2009. So that was the time, if I'm rightly informed, at the University of Cambridge. Afterwards, he became the Barton M. Biggs Professor at Yale University, and in 2015 joined the history department at Columbia University. I just want to briefly mention Adam's tremendously successful books. First, there is a kind of trilogy. The first one, Statistics and the German State, 1900 to 1945, The Making of Modern Economic Knowledge. That's Cambridge University Press in 2001. Then Wages of Destruction, The Making and Breaking of the Nazi Economy, that's Penguin Allen Lane, 2006, and The Deluge, The Great War and the Remaking of the Global Order, 1916-1931, again, Penguin Allen Lane in 2014. One of the books that even, I think, broke the ice with an insanely vast audience was the 2018 Crashed: How a Decade of Financial Crisis Changed the World. One of the very few books, I think, in existence that actually tries to come to terms with one of the great, let's say, also political enigmas of our time, namely the one occasion where everything the left had always hoped for actually happens. And it did not result in a novel left-wing politics. Why that happened, I think Adam's book helps us to understand. The most recent of his book publications, and I'm leaving aside of the numerous article publications, is Shutdown: How COVID Shook the World's Economy. That's again Penguin Allen Lane in 2021. All his work received much acclaim. He was nominated for numerous prizes, won several prizes, published in all the big news outlets, and was in 2019 even named one of the top global thinkers of the decade by Foreign Policy magazine. It's a tremendous pleasure to have you with us, Adam. Thank you for taking out the time of your busy schedule and talking to us. And now I shut up and give the word to Aga.
I'm very excited to have you in our podcast, Adam. Thank you very much. We would like to begin with a biographical question. As Frank mentioned, you graduated with a BA in economics from King's College. After that, you went to Free University of Berlin, a time in which you also witnessed the fall of the Berlin Wall, and with it the defeat of socialism and a certain reorganization of the world, if we may put it this way. Afterwards, you moved back to London, to the LSE, for your doctoral studies under the supervision of Alan Milwand, who was an economic historian, in case some of our viewers are not aware of him. Could we say that you're a historian of economy, as well as you're interested in contemporary theory and philosophy? Could you tell us a bit more about your intellectual trajectory, the theoretical and political context you traversed, as well as your theoretical interests?
No, thank you. It's an absolute pleasure to be here. I'm a big fan of the show, avid listener. So it's a real honor, and it's particularly so because obviously philosophy and theory are your central preoccupations. And I mean, I'm fascinated in critical theory, have been since my youth, but practice history, and so it's a real honor for me to be in conversation with you guys. I think the early formative influence was certainly growing up in West Germany at the time of the 70s, 80s, early 90s, where history took on this critical function of coming to terms with the past, Vergangenheitsbewältigung, as the Germans called it, and quite deeply absorbing that mission of history as a critical project, within limits, of course, because it's defined by its object, the Holocaust, National Socialism. It was a historical culture relatively immune to Marxism, so it's not the same as, say, the British Marxist or the French or the Italian Marxist historical traditions, but it's a kind of liberal criticism which is about truth, the refusal of denial, all of those kind of things. So that was an important formation. But this was also the Germany of the Historikerstreit, the conflicts that Habermas was a key protagonist in. So also, again, a rather highfalutin kind of late classical experience of European public intellectual life. Cross-cut then, in my case, because I returned to the UK in the 80s with Marxism Today, Birmingham School, the revival of Gramscian Marxism in Britain in that period. And then a kind of French dose, which came through my fascination with the history of knowledge, power knowledge complex, which sort of took me towards Foucault, Latour, and those kind of people. So at some level, a fairly standard mixture for my generation, I guess, but then fused with economics, which I think is perhaps the relatively unusual part of this. Not now, because since 2008, there has been such a flourishing of the convergence of economics. But generationally, there was a gap here. I mean, notoriously, in American humanities departments, there was no one who could teach the history of capitalism. That's no longer the case, mercifully. But in this hiatus, it was a question of sort of bricolage, of putting the different bits together. Odd spaces would emerge, like the accounting department of the London School of Economics included people like Peter Miller, who were early interpreters and readers of the Collège de France lectures on governmentality, and were hybridizing the knowledge of the interner of power knowledge and accountancy with critical theory. The miners' strike in Britain played an important dynamizing role in this because it forced the question of how we assess efficiency and profitability to the center of the debate. And it's really in those interstices between the broad perspectives of critical theory and the sweep of historical narrative, which is something I kind of habitually engage in, and technical knowledge that I really, that's really where I found my niche and my home. And the change in media is important for this because the social media space, Twitter, critical macro finance, all of these strands have emerged in the weird interface between academic thinking, market thinking, journalism, and critical commentary. So my home now, above all, I think, is in that blogosphere, newsletter, Substack space, which, is anchored in books on the one hand and in academic activity on the other, but that's really the milieu. So I think of myself now as very much shaped by that, and the last two books and the one I'm currently writing on climate are all very much in that space, rather than the project of critical history that was the work of the 70s, 80s, 90s.
It almost sounds like a reinvention or a reformatting of the role of the public intellectual, actually, with different.
That's what we're seeing, right? And specific expertise, right? I take very seriously those sociologies of expertise which say that in some senses we need to move away from the figure of Sartre, who for me is nevertheless a huge inspiration, to the figure of somebody like Foucault, who at least performatively will tell us about how prison mechanisms operate. I would argue that we've taken that one step further, and there are people who are really doing ethnologies of wealth management who train to be wealth managers, or in my case, a really quite serious formation in economics as a foundation for trying to do critical approaches. Another way, a trite formula would be the Marxian one, right? So it's German philosophy, it's British economics, and it's French politics / history is the trio that we're trying to combine.
Yeah, I mean, to single out another just quite fascinating biographical detail that we came across while preparing for our conversation today. And it concerns your grandfather, Arthur Wynne, to whom you dedicated The Wages of Destruction. And he was, well, if we're not wrong, a Soviet spy operating under the pseudonym of Agent Scott. And in that role, he was a recruiter of spies for the Soviet NKVD, so the People's Commissariat for Internal Affairs. And if we didn't get this wrongly, this activity involved or entailed, inter alia, a sort of screening process of the Oxford members of the Communist Party in the 1930s for who might be good spy material in the end. So did the particular peculiar affiliation have any impact or effect on you? I mean, this is, I mean, saturated with history, so to speak.
Yes, even before we knew any details about this, that was the vibe in my maternal grandparents, and it was absolutely the informative space for me. I would consider their home to have really been, because I had a rather checkered childhood, moved around a lot. That was really my home. Their breakfast table, which was a space of cosmopolitan intellectual politics, was what shaped me. I often think that the blogosphere is really, for me, a reenactment of their breakfast table. It's you wake up in the morning and there's something in Le Monde that's really interesting, and so you have to have out, Le Monde's take on the Sheinbaum presidency in Mexico was like a fairly typical early morning conversation. And at some point you begin to wonder why, what milieu this comes out of. And then muckraking journalism in the 80s, it was The Spycatchers, a book that really broke the story. And it's been confirmed by American academic scholars since. And I've had it confirmed to me in Moscow. I've actually seen the recruitment letter that was sent from the Moscow embassy in 36. So yes, basically he has the distinction of being at both Trinity Oxford and Trinity Cambridge. And the KGB thought they would build an Oxford network to match the very successful and famous Cambridge network. And he was one of the linchpins in that. It goes back to his period in the Weimar Republic. So he went to study agronomy, the peasant question, in Berlin in the early 30s, was there when the Reichstag burned. He was working with the liberal economist Arobi, wrote one of the first studies of agrarian policy in the Hitler regime for the economic journal then edited by Keynes. Married I believe it's Lysian Ostrowski. So going by the family name, she is the daughter of Otto Ostrowski, who was believe it or not, the SPD mayor of Prenzlauer Berg. So he was the boss of, I mean, I can't confirm exactly, but, what are the odds that there's two left-wing families called Ostrowski in Berlin? They're not zero, but there's fairly probable. She turned out to be hell on wheels, apparently, divorced her and then married my grandmother, who was a significant social researcher in her own right, wrote the first studies of fatherless families in Britain, major figure in family law, family policy. And so, yeah, no, they were for me, and I knowingly dedicated Wages of Destruction to them. For me, they are emblematic of a kind of, a British cosmopolitanism. So they were multilingual, which for their version of the English elite in their period was not uncommon, but had become very uncommon by the 70s and 80s. So again, this question of echoes frank of different modes of public intellectualism, and they were a link between my British identity and my European existence, because my grandfather, unsurprisingly, was fluent in German and a little bit of Russian and a little bit of Bulgarian and some Spanish, and he had literally been in all of those places. He'd been in Madrid in 36 and Berlin in 33 and Sofia. I mean, it's a classic communist international story. And so that did undoubtedly shape, my understanding of what public engagement should look like. It also, however, had this distinctive British twist, which is it was radically empirical. So I think they were engaged in a long-term struggle with eugenics, which of course was one of the besetting ideas of left science from the interwar period onwards. And they ended their days, he died over his word processor. I mean, literally like happily making lists of new projects he was going to do. And they were working on antenatal care and the development, so biosocial issues, which I think is where quite a lot of the British left went after their God died. And then they would focus on child poverty. They worked with Frank Field, left wing of the Labour Party, Ken Livingstone. That kind of milieu in London was where the continuities ran. So there is but it had that distinctively British insistence on poverty measurement, and a struggle. It wasn't with the questions of biological determination.
Let's move on to a different topic, if we may. There is so much going on in the contemporary world, from ongoing wars to looming climate and ecological catastrophes, from potential economic crisis, confusion over tariffs, and not only looming refugee crisis to worry many, namely the development and the power of unleashed by AI. and what they will mean not only for social but also for political and economic life. There is at least a rumor that AI came up with a formula that was used to calculate the tariffs that U.S. recently imposed. So we are faced with many problematic sites at the same time. Is this one of the reasons why you see the concept of polycrisis as instructive to think through our current predicament? As a concept, it can serve, as you indicated, I'm quoting, as a reminder of the indeterminacy and uncertainty and complexity that we have lost amidst the bold new certainties of the capitalist scene. In what way is the indeterminacy linked to the concept of polycrisis productive? What does it add to the concept of uncertainty or indeterminacy that is not already in them? Would it be fair to say that in your conceptualization, polycrisis is a Latourian concept? If we can be a bit more specific, what we are thinking about is Latour's project of slowing down modernity and its directness by producing hybrid formations. Differently put, is such an approach what informs your understanding and conceptualization of polycrisis?
Oh, so many different angles to pick up on there. I mean, I'm quite interested in. I mean, quite fundamentally interested in where we get concepts from, right? If the fundamental challenge of dealing critically with modernity is to kind of keep up with the pace of change, where is it that we get the conceptual armature with which to deal with this challenge? And I take it to be really a profound problem, not one that can be fixed by modifying some pre-existing theory, or where we can have any confidence at all that the classical traditions of critical theory inherited from the 19th century and passed down and developed provide us with the tools that we need. And instead, you know, and I've been watching Stuart Hall videos a lot recently. I taught Policing the Crisis this term, and I find in him precisely this kind of relentless, our problem is not to rehash existing theory. Our problem is to be at least as smart as the conjuncture. And that will involve a kind of magpie activity of desperately appropriating whatever handles we have for understanding the world that might be there. This I take to be the gesture of Marx as well in the 1850s. Like, where do you go? You take scraps of British political economy and German philosophy and patch them together. And it's all pretty much of the moment stuff, right? Marx doesn't really have a deep classical tradition to draw on in putting those things together, and we shouldn't pretend to ourselves that we do. Now, having said that, polycrisis for me is not the key term that does that. It's more a reminder of the fact that this is the challenge, right? The term is not in and of itself of much content at all. Where did I get it from? Jean-Claude Juncker, God help us, was like tossing this concept around. So it's almost a kind of found object type approach. Like, it's like the urinal. Like, hey, this might be our condition, is the kind of gesture. He's using the phrase. At this point, don't we at least have to acknowledge that this is the kind of world that we're in? And it's a standing reminder to me. I've described it also, and I live it, I feel, I hope, as a kind of almost practice of self-destabilization. Like, on any given day, in any given moment, you know, are we facing, is this thinking that we're engaged in facing the true destabilization of concepts and realities that we have to deal with? And this is a struggle, I think, in interpreting a figure like Musk and Trump. We'll come on to that maybe later in the conversation. So for me, it has that kind of, it's, as Germans would say, a Stachel, right? It's a Ansporn. It's something that digs into you and goes, oh, this is awkward. How on earth can I be using this term? It's that kind of a provocation. It's the sand in the oyster. It's that kind of jarring idea. Yes, it does. It does have, for me, an origin perhaps in thinking with the social theory of somebody like Latour. Above all, against any Procrustean bed, any kind of prior assumption that we know already what the balance between the micro and the macro, what the context of this is that we're trying to analyze. It's an insistence that it will be multifarious. That's one of the things that I think Poly does do for us without further specifying. And I actually see that as a productive, generative idea rather than a deficit, because I think many friends on the left say this is basically just a cop-out. You're refusing to follow analysis to its ultimate conclusion. And the ultimate conclusion will, of course, be some capitalocentric reduction of the conjuncture to some ultimate determination. And I find, that is something that I want quite deliberately to resist or erect obstacles to. I mean, I would read it, and there is in that sense a link to Latour's concept of the hybrid. But I would read it slightly differently in that my read of Latour is that the hybridity is the logic of modernity. The hybridity is not an answer to modernity. The logic of modernity is the constant creation of these weird objects, which modernist social theory says don't exist, right? And the real function of Latourian critique is to actually allow us to see the hybridity which generates the incredible motive power and development of modern societies. And what he then wants to do by means of clarifying the hybrids we're dealing with is slow us down. And I'm not sure I would subscribe to that politics at all. There's a kind of liberal accelerationist in me that is not down with that. But the function is certainly, as you suggest, Agon, of the Polycrisis term, its useful function to me is to insist on the hybridity as the essential governing dynamic. And the repeated, recurring repetition of these kind of conjunctures. I mean, for me, there were these moments during the COVID epidemic where, we would have accelerated summer wildfires in California driven by climate change, which are normally put out by fire teams recruited from California's overcrowded prisons, who couldn't be mobilized under these circumstances because the prisons were shot through with COVID. Right, that for me is a ghastly demonstration of the kind of reality. You invoke the uncertainty term, and I'll just this is another way in which Polycrisis functions for me. If it's less deterministic than your capitalocentric left analysis, which just simply says, well, that situation in California is just neoliberal capitalism gone wrong, all of the things fall into place. It's also much more able to diagnose the situation than the sort of metaphysical gesturing to radical uncertainty, Knightian uncertainty, all of this kind of thing, which became so very, very fashionable amongst the smarter talking heads after 2008, right? One of the ways in which people addressed the 2008 financial crisis was to say, oh, silly us, we thought we could regulate this easily. Actually, this is instance of radical uncertainty. Read Frank Wright, read Keynes. This is where we need to go. And that to my mind is a really very transparent evasion of the responsibility that we have thinking about causality, and because after all the financial crisis of 2008 was in no way unpredictable. In many ways, in fact, the question ought to be why it hadn't happened sooner. The same is true with the pandemic, right? And so for me, the Polycrisis term is an intervention at the meta level in the politics of interpretation, in the power plays around the interpretation between the predictable and the unpredictable, the explicable and the inexplicable. And it's this stachel, it's this spur to thinking harder about that.
Maybe just spontaneously as a mediation into the next question, I always liked. I think that sort of out of context quotation by Althusser that the lonely hour of the last instance never comes the most somehow, right? I mean, because that is making your point in some sense, right? I mean, so sure, it is a hermeneutical framework that helps us understand certain things, but nevertheless, to just think we could reduce it to a merely, let's say, economic determination is just ultimately a vulgar assumption that does not live up to the complexity of the phenomena.
And what do we make of that never coming, right? I mean, it's like, is that I was involved in an argument with Riley about My Book Wages of Destruction, in which he says there's a sense of a vacuum at the heart of this explanation. And for me, I mean, I think he meant that as a criticism. And to my mind, that's actually a compliment about, because I think there is a void when it comes to the explanation of Nazi Germany, and we shouldn't pretend otherwise, right? And so that determination in the final instance never arriving is not it's a structural condition of, it's a little bit like the void in democratic political theory, right? That void is not an accident, and it's not a deficiency of analysis. It actually expresses, that's our best bet at somehow enclosing conceptually a space we can't enter.
Yeah, and
directly.
We wanted to ask you how maybe this void relates to something else that you highlighted a number of times, namely that a number of times in your lifetime you have been directly affected by history in the making somehow. And I think some examples you gave was the 1980s Intifada in Palestine, collapse of the GDR when you were in Berlin, but also pandemic, which sort of generated writing. As in the aftermath of it, the shutdown book, and so we wanted to raise the question: what does it mean for you to methodologically to think in such an involved manner, and not to be able to always be at a, let's say, safe distance with regard to the very historical conjunctures and developments and phenomena one attempts to analyze? I mean, you opposed such approach of beginning in the middle, or thinking in medias res, to the approach that believes that it can begin at the beginning, while the former, so your in medias res approach, allows to live up to the discontinuous and, let's say, open and uncertain character of historical conjunctures. The latter, so the beginning at the beginning, can come at least with certain quite problematic implications like historical continuity, linearity, even structure, stability, right? It's like an exercising of contingency. And so while you can endorse a certain form, if we understand correctly, form of political pragmatism, maybe even a principle pragmatism, the latter, the beginning at the beginning, seems to detach itself from the thrownness into the muddy historical waters and tries to purify itself. So we wanted to raise, and I think it's a methodological question. What does it mean to begin in medias res? So what is the res in whose middle we start, so to speak? Is it, as someone like Hegel would have suggested in the phenomenology, can we start anywhere with any given phenomena? Freud will say something very similar. We can begin analysis just by chatting and picking up this or that word or this or that thought. Or does one need something more, I don't know, out of the ordinary? But you would call it an event, a certain disturbance that is generative of history, or is it neither?
Yeah, no, I love this question. I mean, what are the race? I mean, and then there's the other question of, like, how on earth would we know whether we were in medias? Like, in the middle, it's such a presumptuous claim, right? I mean, typical white guy kind of phrase. It's like, oh, the entire world organizes around myself, and like I'm in the middle of those things. You're so vain, you think this song is about you. Like I honestly, I mean, my simple answer, and it's just the standard answer of any existentialism or life philosophy back to the late 19th century, which then, of course, has its origins in idealism, is like, we simply don't have any alternative. Where do we even get off imagining that there's any alternative to this? It's like I totally get why on any given morning you might wake up and espouse some structuralist social theory that will tell you where things started and where they ended up. Like, fine. But like, it's just what you did before coffee. Like, you didn't, it's not, and of course, lots of people have done this, and it's a powerful tradition, and you can quote your Charles Tilly and your Marx and your Perry Anderson and all these people, and it's great. But like, all any of them ever did was get up in the morning and make coffee and write a book, right? So it's for me, it's not so much a choice as just a sort of self-consciousness and self-awareness about the thrownness of where we're at. and then, as it were, employing whatever methodologies work in any given moment in quite an open-ended way to help us stabilize, frame, crucially establish collective meaning. This isn't, after all, just, I mean, we're not in a voluntarist kind of situation. Like, the number of thoughts in our head is extremely limited. LLM models are giving us a humbling, demonstration of how constrained actually the sphere is of options. How then do we establish meaningful community with other people engaged in this same business? Those are the relevant questions for me, not, this just to me, it's not, when you're honest about our situation, it's not even a choice. It's really just a matter of coming to consciousness. And with the point of view of where we start, you could follow a school. In other words, I don't know, we've decided the central problem is the origins of capitalism in Britain, and we can take, the Brenner position or somebody else's position, and that's fine. But that is what we're doing before coffee on any given day, right? That's what we're doing. Or I know, and I've spent years in analysis. You start with the odd sensation you had as you said hello to your analyst that morning, or something that happened on the subway, and it is again just simply absurd to imagine that you're better off starting off talking with your childhood trauma. That's the useful thing to do in your analysis that morning. That's just, for the vast majority of people, certainly in my experience and certainly in the view of my analysts, that isn't the effective way to start, right? It may be that you end up there, and of course it's not stupid to have ideas about that, but the problem is precisely, what is the relationship deeply between this immediate experience, this immediate contingency, this immediate reality, and those deeper structures, which no one's going to deny that they're there. It's just that the thought that we can immediately access them in a straightforward way is superficial. I mean, ultimately, it's superficial and quite likely to be self-deluding, quite likely to serve as various types of a form of kind of structural escapism in the end, whereas the real challenge is to be. This was the other kind of puzzlement for me. It's like, you think being in medias res is easy, and this is like the liberal cop-out, whereas the hard thing is to do the structure. Have you ever even been to a single yoga session? Have you ever actually tried to be in the moment, just calmly in the moment for even 30 seconds, and seen how difficult it is? That, for me, is this is the challenge of any serious existential philosophy of, across all of the familiar names that you folks and your usual guests address so deeply. That is the challenge, and it's utterly non-trivial, and you can't get there by way of some simple social theory. That's not an answer to this problem in any serious way. And so from that point of view, you just go to a Crocean position. All history is contemporary history, because sure, it's history, but it's anchored around your given moment and our need for orientation in that space. Yes, there is a kind of affinity for a pragmatism, a Deweyan pragmatism. Chuck Sable is one of my best friends and soulmates at Columbia. Like, he and I really do vibe very well, though I'm coming from a slightly different. His is very much an American pragmatic tradition. That's not so much my cup of tea. But yes, that recognition of the profound difficulty of this problem, and to that extent, there is it's not an anything goes, but it's a rather more, what in terms of the starting point, it's rather more, can we find a way in? Jamie Peck had, wrote this rather good essay recently about conjunctural analysis, and he picked up this phrase from Stuart Hall about breaking into the conjuncture, and that strikes me as a very, very. Anything that, this is the way that analysis works as well, right? You find the seam, you find the telling, itching, difficult, the point that you can put your finger on, not in an obsessive and formulaic way, but that's what we're gently trying to find a space to enter into the problem. And I think that to me is, again, if we thought we knew a priori where those points of entry would be, then we wouldn't have the problems we have. If it was obvious, then we're back in the glorious days of the Comintern, and we all just know it's a problem of the geometry of different types of class factions and so on. That's wonderful if you think that actually works. The track record ain't great, but so that, for me, that idea of the present and history being this mysterious object that we need to find ways of breaking into, that humility of analytical position really structures everything I do. And all my books have been written around moments where I thought, here's a way in. And it's more often than not some graph or some data, and I think, like this is something that we can work on and widen and then see what. So it is tactic, methodology. One could also here go to the language of military theory. I'm very much of the Foucauldian generation in that respect. Clausewitz is somebody I teach. I teach military history because I think it's an interesting body, not just because it's materially important, but because theoretically the military, this is Lenin's thinking in these terms is also interesting because he's so much, and Althusser picks this up with the Machiavellian stuff, like the tactics is itself. The fact that tactics matter tells you something about strategy and even ontology, right? It tells you something really fundamental about the world, that the way in which we engage with it has this tactical dimension. We can smooth that out and call it methodology as much as we like, but you can also talk in terms of breaking in terms of the military logic of tactics, like finding the point d'appui, right? And having this coup d'oeil, being able to see the thing, being able to preserve your calm. Because as we all know from analysis and everything else, like this is emotionally unsettling when you do this kind of work. So how can you maintain the calmness? What sort of checklists do you use to orientate yourself? All of that military stuff, all of a sudden, which is also interesting from the point of view of financial crisis management and so on, because that's a field of analogy that they employ. I mean, this is a very long answer, but the tactics of navigating that space is, yes, I mean, it's really, it's the greatest gift that, one of the greatest gifts intellectually, that criticism from Perry Anderson is that one of the greatest gifts I've received in my adult life intellectually is that it forced me to recognize that is what we're up against. Certainly I feel we're up against. This is the New Left review of my work, that just for casual listeners, that is a New Left review a few years back, and it was out of the blue and quite shocking at the time and disorientated me. But it contains this phrase, and I mean, it's proved very, very generative.
You mentioned Marxism, so let's discuss Marxism and Marx a little bit. You're quite critical of classical and orthodox as well as of academic Marxists, and rightly so, Frank and I would say. In your Deleuze, you offer a very interesting and unorthodox reading of Lenin. You consider the Bolshevik Revolution to be not merely a realization of some ideological fantasies, but also a strategic response to World War I, if we got this correctly. You read the Brest-Litovsk Agreement not as a betrayal of the basic principles or ideals of the revolution, but rather as a continuation of the revolutionary strategy. And thereby you place Lenin at the center of making the global order, which allows you to oppose his vision, that is Lenin's vision, to that of Woodrow Wilson as one of the two forms of universality, so to speak. Furthermore, you seem to argue that Lenin is a precursor or initiator of the multipolar world. Is there something for you in the Marxist tradition that is still today worthy of salvaging or reinventing, even after its total failure in the previous century?
Oh, I mean, I don't. The answer is emphatic. I don't know whether salvaging is the thing I would want to be doing. It's that kind of, build your repertoire to bits and pieces. But I still don't think there's any more important test for social theory than to measure itself against the ambition of the great Marxist thinkers from 19th century onwards, all the way down to the recent generation, Zizek and people like this, if one can categorize him in that way, right? If you're not doing that, you're not really in the game, to my mind. Whatever your other politics may be, this is the whetstone, this is the standard against which we have to measure theoretical endeavor. And so, I mean, I would, if you ask me, like Lenin, it's anyone who's serious about thinking about politics and history must read Lenin and must read Lenin carefully. You just don't understand, not only because of what he did, but because of how he thought about what he was doing. I mean, sometimes I think this is taken as a facetious comment, but it was reading Lenin day by day for writing this book, Deluge, that I think raised for me the possibility that really the most challenging form of intellectual endeavor might be blogging. It might be daily analysis. It might be this challenge of thinking the real as it happens before your eyes. And in Deluge, what I above all, the deeper level was trying to do was to think through philosophies of history, right? One of the theses of the book essentially is that the early 20th century breaks all of the 19th century philosophies of history. I'd spent a lot of time teaching philosophy of history at this point, and starting with the struggles over Fukuyama, and Anderson's really rather good review of Fukuyama, and what's so fascinating about Lenin, Wilson, Lloyd George, Clemenceau, and German social democrats in the period is that they are having to think through the logic of history and how it operates and how political agency functions in that space. And there are just these passages in Lenin. I mean, on a day-by-day basis. I mean, the book is written on the backdrop of a giant, literally day-by-day chronology of events from 1916 on through 1931. And the subtle shifts in the position within the Bolshevik Party in the spring of 1918, as they struggle over the ratification of Brest, are moments of real profound depth in thinking about the philosophy of history. I mean, Weber's Politics as a Vocation, not for nothing, starts with what is in fact a made-up quote from Trotsky at Brest. My great friend Stefan Eich and I were able to establish that he had actually traduced Trotsky to produce the standard Weberian account of politics. So for me, a little bit like in the Cambridge tradition of the history of political thought, I see a minute day-by-day attention to the development of political thought in time as profoundly generative. So let me just read you these passages from Lenin. The course of history. This is Lenin in May 1918. The course of history that Marxist theory had naturally imagined as straight, and which we must imagine as straight in order to see the beginning, the continuation, and the end, was, in real life, never straight. It was incredibly involved. Huge zigzag and gigantic complex turns were unleashed as millions began the agonizing process of making their own history. So this, from an economist point of view, is out of equilibrium, right? Once we're off the path of determination and we move from prehistory to history, what sort of logic actually is engaged at the point where, the underlying structural determinations become weak? And then there's this incredible phrase, as Lenin put it in a truly astonishing statement to the party at the end of April 1918, which is actually only republished in certain editions of his work. If we as a single troop of the world proletariat, as the first troop, have moved into the lead, it's not because this troop is better organized. It has moved to the first place because history is not developing rationally. Like, this is worthy of a Zizek, right? This is why Zizek, loves Lenin so much. It's like he's basically saying that the condition of our success is that the theory on which we profess to rule is in fact losing its internal grip, right? These are the sorts of things which fascinate me and that make a thinker like Lenin so essential to revisit. I am currently learning Mandarin, and so I'm actually reading Mao quite a lot for those purposes to just energize the project. And his thinking about contradiction is obviously really profoundly fascinating. So no, I see lots in that tradition to reappropriate. I teach Marxism and philosophy of history, Marxist philosophy all the time. It's not so much a specific set of ideas as the determination to think thoughts like the ones that I just read out from Lenin to their logical conclusion, and the imperative that imposes on people to then elaborate what their underlying philosophy of history is. This is, again, what makes somebody like Stuart Hall, his thinking of the crisis in Britain in the 70s and 80s, so endlessly generative. I mean, really, I can't recommend a reread of Policing the Crisis in the current conjuncture highly enough. It is so utterly resonant of our current moment. You can substitute slogans like anti-Semitism for mugging in that book, and you have a radically relevant read of our current situation. We may come on to talk about Colombia later on. which struggles with all of the problems of the reality of the actual abuse of Jewish people and the meaning that anti-Semitism takes on in a broader context in brilliant ways. It's full of all of the equipment. And that is, of course, generated out of the struggle to make a Marxist analytic work. So, long answer, had a period in a Trot party, common in Britain in the 80s. I learned a lot in the process. I've done Marxism a couple of times in London, an extraordinary kind of festival of radical thinking. Can't claim any long-term personal party affiliation myself, but there's no, in that sense, it doesn't die. In that sense, it changes its relevance and meaning and its reference points.
I mean, it's interesting to highlight, let's say, to use your own terms, the breaking in quality of Marxism itself.
Yes.
And the affirmation of maybe, I mean, let's say the incompleteness of a historical conjuncture that necessitates a tactical approach somehow, because that seems to be just to bring together some of the things we talked about thus far. That seems to be an approach that is fundamentally subverting what Aristotle thought could be a stable distinction or two modes of relating to history. Namely, one is the philosophical and one is the historical one. The historian basically gives an account of how things were and can be more or less detailed. But the philosopher, this is why Aristotle thinks, I mean, with all the arrogance, is more interesting because the philosopher thinks about how it potentially could have evolved, right? How it could have been, and thereby also is able to reflect on what it ought to be. But you seem to be in all the things you just said in your work, actually very strongly undermining this distinction. I think you once described your approach as something like producing what you call knowledge of the flux from within the flux. So in some sense, one could say there is an intervention, but the intervention is not like totally blind, but it's finding the right points, as you described it previously, that then create, well, maybe a possibility of intelligibility or something like that. Aristotle would probably think, I mean, would probably have troubles thinking that, or would think this is so monstrous as an approach because it's neither just philosophy, even though it mobilizes the concept, nor is it just history because it mobilizes the concept. So, but would you see yourself being, let's say, between these two Aristotelian chairs, which, I mean, just inventing a new chair almost?
I think the chair is really, in its modern form, right, it's a 19th century conception of what history does. Like, on the right, it's somebody like a Treitschke. On the left, it's the entire canon of Marxist historiography, which, and you could extend this, feminist historiography, black radical historiography, is always simultaneously an act of interpretation and an act of reinterpretation, and by virtue of reinterpretation and intervention. So that distinction puzzles. I mean, I'm not sufficiently steeped in classical Greek philosophy to really appreciate the depth of that. But as a modern person, that distinction puzzles me. I have to say, like, I'm not sure I quite even understand how you would imagine that would be the case. I mean, there are very, very naive understandings of history as chronicle that would get you somewhere there, maybe. But that does require a kind of very stringent understanding of what chronicle is. Once we're in the business of narrativizing and plotment and so on, we've got direction, we've got telos, we've got the motivate, we've got the idea of changing our readers' minds or catering to their preconceptions, feeding their existing identity. At that point, all of these things take on a very concrete reality, and I would push that further, and I've been surprised. But if you write, I mean, you referred to it in the introduction. If you write a book like Crash that was very, very widely read, you are simply naive if you think that doesn't shape the way in which people think about the problems that then face them. And in the case of that book, because it summarized a very powerful critique of the Obama administration, it had a direct impact on the thinking of folks in the Democratic Party when They won the congressional majority. Because the book's impact you alluded to has something to do in the US with the fact that it appeared in the fall of 2018, just before the Democrats won back the House and the Senate, and just before, therefore, the mobilization began to happen. Very much a social process, a lot of money in the background moving the pieces, but out of that came the Green New Deal. Out of that came the left wing in New York, which puts a lot of pressure on a very important politician, Chuck Schumer. Those people, they're his staffers, are all over this stuff. They think of themselves self-consciously as historical actors in the American liberal tradition. It's about saving the republic and making it a more perfect republic. They refer to history incessantly as a guide to what they're doing. And so books like this it took me very much, but I'll have to say, I mean, intellectually I could recapitulate how I started, but the actual impact of it was much wider and much deeper than I ever imagined. And so at that point, we're really talking about almost post-mortem, after the battle, learning from history in a staggeringly direct way, like where you have a senior politician sit opposite you and say, so you're telling me the next time we ought to go big. And what can you say? Yes, that's what you're saying. Yeah, next time go big. So yeah, at that point it's totally monstrous. No, I mean I don't even disagree. From it actually feels monstrous in several different levels, and the weight of responsibility is quite heavy. And I'm not a team transitory guy on inflation for nothing. Like I take this also to be. I mean, the link there is that if you went big on fiscal policy and then inflation emerged from that, and inflation causes Trump, then your policy prescription has some, you're carrying a pretty heavy burden. So it drives your thought. Your thought becomes highly motivated. And even if you were in the other mode of writing history, I would insist that, at least for one moment in your life, you ought to do this kind, because otherwise you literally don't understand what it means to be the sort of person which more often than not history books are written about, namely engaged people. There are some history books about people who float through history, or, there's no such thing really, but just ordinary, normal, non-historical figures. You can imagine writing that kind of book. But it takes a kind of willful construction of the world to remove people's agency. And as soon as you recognize the agency, little and large, then all of a sudden, all of these issues of personal responsibility and, the do or die quality of choice really enter in. And a history book which is written, a novel, a historical, any account of human existence which is written whilst abstracting from that is in one way or another stunted, right? It's failing to actually recognize what a certain sort of historical existence means. So it's been I think profoundly healthy to experience the shock of responsibility that follows from this kind of writing. But anyone who does policy takes this risk every single day of the flipping week. Anyone who runs anything, anyone even just as minor as a university department, takes a view, makes a choice. And so, yes, that monstrosity is one that I think in the modern period we have to take as a given. I think that historicization, I think I'm willing to live with that.
Well, we have so much to cover, so we are skipping some questions, if that is okay with you. So you mentioned that you're writing a book on the climate change. What we want to ask you is, what is your angle of approach? We are asking this because among other things, some claims have been made by people like Andreas Malm that the pandemic showed, if a global threat is taken seriously and perceived as unavoidable, this can compel massive global action. The problem with climate crisis would then be, in this maybe rather epistemological or ideological critical rendering, that we need to first believe what we know. But there is also a more maybe realistic or cynical version of the problem, namely that even when those in governmental power who seem to deny the existence of climate change prepare for climate change through exclusion of refugees, an entire bunker economy, and all of it, by privatizing and hijacking the means of protection against it. So, what is or would have been your approach? This is a real question, as you have once indicated, that our best chance for a new form of political organization, a new order to emerge, may be linked to mobilizations around the climate crisis.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, Andreas and I both wrote books about COVID and climate politics, or I'm in the business of writing that book right now. So I like him, do find it very instructive to compare the two moments. And we underrate COVID so seriously, it's unbelievable, because it utterly dominated our lives and changed the way we live, and yet it's as though it never happened. And yet it clearly is highly instructive as to what is possible. And the contrast is telling. I guess for me, though, the interest in writing the climate book is actually more detached. I'm for me the claim. I mean, I'm more in the kind of Bonneuil and Frézos kind of approach. These are these two brilliant French historians of science who wrote a book about the Anthropocene, and Frézos most recently one about the idea of the energy transition, who make the move of saying. And this is you could relate this to the perspective of an Ulrich Beck, for instance. What does it mean about society that we agitate ourselves with something as remote and abstract and deep in the future and subtle and complex in the first instance as the climate crisis? Well, what does this tell us about our society? Because Andreas and other activists immediately go to the impatient gesture, which is, and why don't we do enough about it, given what the science tells us? Whereas my approach is more, well, hang on, science of various types has told us about endless huge problems. Like, we don't do anything about the vast majority of them. Sure, we did something about COVID, but if we were actually serious about keeping children alive, we wouldn't allow the current circumstances. And, medical science tells us what's necessary to keep African children alive. And do we do anything about it? No. Have we ever done anything about it? No. Can we do something about it? Yes. In due course, things happen. So for me, the book is really an effort to historicize the climate governance and the climate episteme, the climate frame as a way of thinking about governance. And the basic hypothesis is that in the wake of the collapse of socialism and the classic question of capitalism and democracy of the 20th century, the question of the ability to self-regulate, quote unquote, around climate became the emblem for the Western, European, and American liberal elites of the challenge of the era after socialism. This became the real touchstone, the real acid test. And so there is an arc that runs from the early climate science of the 80s through to Paris and the Sustainable Development Goals, which were both agreed in the fall of 2015. And that we are now exiting, and then I think that paradigm has collapsed. It's broken. It's no longer serving as a powerful organizational tool. And I feel we need a history of the rise and fall. I think we have to say at this point of that rupturing, apart from anything else, because it was so recalcitrantly, and this is a criticism Andreas knows I would make of his work, which is it's so recalcitrantly Western centric. I mean, it centers the West as the major source of climate crisis, which it no longer is. Historically, yes, but no longer as the main driver, not by a long chalk. It centers the dilemmas of democratic politics when, in fact, the big players are authoritarian emerging market players, above all China. And it centers solutions in the West when, in fact, the reality staring us in the face is that, I just did a post about it this morning, that China's investment in renewable energy is now running multiples ahead of the West. And so this brings us back to the Stalin problem, in my view. So in terms of my biography, this is the Stalin problem of our generation. This is the Soviet modernization problem of our generation. The T-34 of our generation is the Chinese photovoltaic panel. And that for me is the challenge. And I don't say that flippantly. I don't say that in an easy way. It poses really profound challenges for our thinking about modernity, and particularly for liberals. But I also think the left basically has a void where China politics needs to be, and you can see why it's not developed on the left. It's been a long time since anyone on the left thought seriously about China. The last was the great infatuation with Maoism. There was a brief moment of interest in the Chinese New Left, but that, I think, is the generational challenge. And for me, that's where I want to move. Whereas I see Andreas mobilizing all his brilliance around essentially reviving, the real classics, like war communism, for heaven's sake, as like a paradigm for thinking about the current moment. And he just does the trot state capitalism thing when it comes to China. It's a cop-out, in my view. It doesn't grasp the challenge. So the book is like the other two in this mode, so the shutdown and crashed, an effort to, from within, if you like, the mainstream, try and jar us into the world in which, America's going to be responsible going forward for the next century, perhaps for somewhat less than 10% of global emissions. It isn't the future of the world is no longer ours to decide, and that's not a matter of choice or moralism or anything else. It's just a reality of this particular problem, and that's what makes it so fascinating to me. It's like here materialism bites in a extraordinarily direct way, and we can simplify it to this one variable, right? So this was for me a breaking in moment when I saw the graphs for Chinese CO2 emissions and coal emissions. It's like, okay, like we start from here. Like when we're in a world in which China is responsible for 1/3 of global CO2 emissions, and it's happened in 20 years, this is the thing that we need to center our thinking around and see how it moves and shakes us.
Yeah, and it's really, really, I think, interesting, connects well to so it's interesting that the different role of the West in a changing, let's say, historical, economic, political landscape. I think David Harvey somewhere remarked once on the the quantities of cement that were, I think, used in China in comparison to the last, I think, 150 years or whatever in the US.
3 years, 3 years
Yeah,
of
yeah.
the big stimulus, 3 years as much cement as the United States in the 20th century.
So
Yeah.
and that's quite an indicator of a changed role, and that means if what you just call grasping the challenge, right? The grasping the challenge in its historical specificity, and that means in its very constitution, this must have something to do with what is, I think, on a lot of people's, at least in the West, minds these days, and what we wanted to talk to you about, namely the results of the most recent elections in the US. Probably there is somewhat a connection between what we just talked about and this. I think in Shutdown, you indicated 3 ways in which one can explain away, let's say, a present challenge. And one is by explaining them by recourse to some past events. It's just the same. I don't know, Trump is just Hitler, right? By indicating, I don't know, we had the first 10 years, so it's just another one. We know what's coming. It's just the same kind of thing. By indicating that there is a larger structure that is far more horrible or far more relevant or far more important. Right? Trump is just a symptom, but what we really need to understand is X. Or by explaining the present away by highlighting almost like the germs of the future that one takes sort of for granted. I think at one point you very convincingly argued that the very frequently cited Gramsci statement, which is quite evocative, right? The old word is dying, the new word struggles to be born, and that is the time of the monsters, of very different monsters, is at the same time almost an optimistic statement, right? I mean, yes, it's not here, and it struggles to actually establish itself, but it's fine. There is a future somehow. However, I don't know, undefined on the horizon. So if these are almost like 3 ways of not grasping the challenge, of not facing up to what the present conjuncture is, we thought we raised the question, if we have to avoid these avoidances, so to speak, or Freud would call them defense mechanisms, right? I mean, and of course, a lot of theoretical labor goes into them not to raise those questions, and not to raise the question, what is Trump actually the name of? To speak in those terms, maybe, And I think there is something really interesting about this because, at least I'm Hegelian at heart, I think, and for a Hegelian, it's quite shocking to say Trump is now a world historical figure. I mean, he did it twice. Just like if one believes that Hegel has a point there, repetition really consolidates the first time, even though it right now does no longer move maybe from tragedy to farce, but the other way around. So maybe the question would be simple. What do you think if we start not in medias res but in medias Trump? How did we end up in this mess? I mean, because you spoke of a crisis of the American government, more or less recently, and Trump seems to be one name that could fall under this umbrella, but that's probably too broad. What is your take on this quite unprecedented repercussions of the most recent election?
Yeah, I mean, I'm tempted to. This is unfair, Frank. So we've got this fast-flowing conversation. There's so much to talk about, but it's almost, to my mind, that move from talking about China emerging as like the world's dominant economic force in material terms to this, oh, what about Trump and how does this affect Trump, is almost one of those evasions. It's like, the and I don't mean that as a genuine criticism of you, but I just the immensity of that shift, I think, overwhelms our capacity really to grasp. I mean, the implication in theoretical terms, after all, could be that the entire history of economic development in the West is really just a prelude to what now happens in China. It's not that China is some version of it. It's literally just the preface. It's the overture. The next thing is the real thing. This is the wager of 21st century Marxism amongst Chinese theorists. If we take them seriously at all, their claim is basically that the beginning, the precursors, all of that thing we like to call the big N, which is all the little states of the emerging markets in Europe, are literally just fragmentary experience. And it will be the lessons learned from the massive development of 1.4 billion people under the leadership of the party that actually tells us how history is made, right? So that's, if you look at the history of manufacturing or the history of steel or cement, that's why they're so telling. The entire history of American modernity, this city I'm looking out at New York, is literally just a blip in China's recent development. Right? So this is the reorientation that brings about. And I do think it totally blows the mind of the American political elite. They cannot, the shipbuilding thing right now is the thing that's blowing them. They say America doesn't build any ships at all, like none other than naval vessels. And they somehow imagine they're going to synthesize into existence an American shipbuilding industry because they realize things move in ships and America ought to be able to. It's truly an almost hallucinogenic state. There is something. Larry Summers wrote a great op-ed almost 10 years ago now, saying that the fundamental question of the future would the American political class even be able to name this phenomenon, even to be able to explicitly recognize it? And one answer to your question of what is Trump the name of is it's essentially the inability of the American political class to do that. Right? They cannot, and he then provides them with the object around which all of the Democratic Party elites organize their thinking, rather than actually having to think about the thing which does profoundly challenge. But I have a kind of more deflationary reading as well, because one will be to say this is a huge storm in the American teacup unleashed by this massive Chinese development. Another one will be to say, is it really a storm in the American political system? Really, at what level is it that? And again, going back to that book Deluge that I wrote about the early 20th century, which could be read as setting up the classic Arno Mayer Wilson versus Lenin kind of clash. Another way of reading it would be to say that the American exceptionalism, both as an ideology and as a reality of politics, namely a society what was absolutely the dominating reality of the early interwar period, right? And the American hegemony, America's role as a central global player, was peculiar amongst other things because America's internal political history is so convulsive and violent and difficult, right? I mean, it's not Yugoslavia, but like, it sort of is Yugoslavia, right? There is this profound problem of race and slavery. There is this profound sectionalism, this highly incomplete process of state formation, a persistence of religiosity of an evangelical kind, a deep skepticism about the power of science and its logics, a sovereigntism that is unbounded in certain crucial ways and is underpinned by a radical ideology. And in some ways, Trump is a sort of predictable, degenerate form of all of those features, right? Plus, with some 21st century characteristics. In fact, you could say characteristics from the 80s and 90s translated forward into the present. And in a highly divided polity in which 1/3 don't vote and 2/3 do, and they're split 51-49% and then 49-51%, his side won through in a highly technical, highly expensive election process to deliver this outcome. And that will be the most deflationary result. Then, of course, he's in power and can churn things up and generate this endless shitstorm of excitement. But then in reality, what does it deliver? Well, this humming and hawing over trade policy, huge announcements. And I don't want to downplay and then, retreat. On tax, it looks like a rerun of the 2017 tax giveaway. On deregulation, it'll be the standard business story of a rather brutal variety, fairly familiar to places of, with right-wing conservative populist governments with majorities. All of this could disappear in the midterms, which is what the Democrats are hoping for when they lose their ability to legislate. That's what many people are hoping for. So you could see this as a significant moment in the process of the hollowing out of American political culture, but as a long-term process with a fairly typical, with a fairly familiar telos. But of course, Trump is a sui generis phenomenon. He has rather personal attributes which are unlike anyone else we've seen in American politics, but he's a familiar figure from American political culture. There are men like him doing his kind of thing in many different roles in American life. And he's representative of an American reality, which is just all too present if you step outside the metropolitan centers and the college towns. Like he's not actually an outlandish figure in the world of the American gentry and the world of, of Mar-a-Lago. This is a social reality which we may have been closing our eyes to, but it's been there. So to come back though and to wrap this back and to offer an explanation, which in some ways, I started with crashed and I think ties to other things we've been saying. I think it's clear that the mediation within the American political elite between major centers of power, whether it's military, financial, industrial, energy, and political authority, which previously was secured by way of the GOP, as the Republican Party as a mechanism of hegemony that secured majorities for NAFTA and then for Chinese accession to WTO, that has really come apart. And the most surprising thing about economic policy right now is its lack of motivation, right? So it's less that we can see a social crisis to which this is a policy response, so much as the crisis consists in the fact that the policy is not an obvious response to any crisis, right? That's actually the more striking thing about the current moment. Biden and Trump won fit more squarely into the model where we say, classic masculine, blue collar, working class, in crisis, China shock, therefore, blah, 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 connect the dots. And people like Jennifer Harris and Jake Sullivan and Biden himself are explicitly articulating this as their historical logic. The astonishing thing and Trump 1 was very much in that vein. The astonishing thing about Trump 2 is it's that as a kind of, surreal freak show in which it's virtually impossible to show any serious lobby group of labor or business which actually asked for this trade war. And this is bamboozling because modern political science in its American form, the sciencey bit of American political science, was literally born in the late 19th century to explain tariffs, right? That's the early experiments in American empirical political science are very much of the atomistic interest group A makes tariff B, argues with interest group C, who wants tariff D, what comes out of the process, it's tariff E. Like that's how this is supposed to work. And the surreal quality of the current moment is that you can't specify whose interests these are in. And so you end up in a and a sense in which policy is being made almost as a form of performance, which is, all policy has a performative aspect, but in this case, it seems to be purely that. And that's what the crisis, I think, ultimately really consists in. So it becomes very difficult to answer questions like, so what is the China policy? Who knows? Honestly, who knows? And under Biden, we had a much clearer idea, and it wasn't reassuring. So I would see Trump as the kind of escalation into the surreal of tendencies that were very pronounced and already well developed in the sequence of Trump, Biden, and then Trump 2.0. So it's not a synthesis in the Hegelian terms. It's a thesis, and then another kind of there's no good dialectic here.
Let's somehow stay in this topic. And against Astra Taylor and Naomi Klein, Naomi Klein's claim that the Trump government annihilates any dimension of the future, you recently endorsed, not unpolemically, the idea that Trump, and they're different from Biden, actually has a vision of a future, and one that is not Elon Musk's, who has his own idea of the future. Your reference was to Trump's claim, made on national television, that for sure welfare of the American nation, now the American people have to suffer some hardship. Can you say something about the role of this kind of future that plays politically? We are asking this because Trump once complained that in the West, governments think within the framework of electoral cycles, which means that you get to do your job for 4 years and then someone else with a slightly different agenda comes in, while the Chinese think on a different historical scale. For they plan for development of their state with a view of the next couple of decades or centuries.
Yeah, I mean, I thought this was a very interesting piece, the Taylor and Klein piece in the Guardian. People should check it out. I mean, it took the whole fascism debate in this extreme direction, right? Because they basically say Trump is nihilistic fascism. So it has all of the authoritarianism and racism of fascism, but they literally say the original fascism had this optimistic upside when for the right people it was about making a people's home, and Trump doesn't have that even, right? So Trump becomes this worse, more nihilistic fascism. And I have my issues with the whole fascist diagnosis, but at the very least, you've got to recognize this is a novel. They're adding an extra twist to this. And when you think about, some of the Palantir people, Thiel and so on, there is a bleak, dark social vision there that is quite fascinating. And it's that exit, they link this to the idea of exit. People like Quinn Slobodian have been doing all this interesting work on the role of exit in extreme right-wing thinking. That's, I think, the line they want to take. I have two problems with it. One is the Elon Musk question, and the other is the tariffs question, which they don't really address. They bend Musk into an end times guy by basically saying that he's all about Mars, and I think that underestimates what Musk is about. But they just don't talk about the tariff politics. And the radical thing about the tariff politics is that it's almost classic future-orientated politics. I was thinking here with the work of Jonathan White, the political scientist. The LSE has written rather interestingly about the question of the long run and future, and for him, the logic of future-orientated politics, which he fears is becoming hollowed out, is that it organizes a critique of the present, that it binds the community of those who are committed to an idea of the future, and that it justifies sacrifice, because you have a trade-off between the present and the future, right? And we can all see in the tradition of the left how that works. And if you apply those criterion to the J.D. Vance, Trump tariff people, that's exactly what they're doing, right? They criticize the present in terms of a future of an imagined reconstruction of American industry. They bind themselves together against those who don't get it, which will be all the liberal elites who are committed to neoliberalism. And they demand that in the short run, and this was the thing that really just blew my mind, was a president on American television saying outright, I actually think you need less stuff. You don't need all of this stuff that you're buying from China. You'll be better off without it, and the future will be better off if we make it at home. He then added, of course, this misogynistic, gendered stuff about your little baby girl and how she doesn't need her Barbie dolls. But that's a whole different subject about the underlying masculinism of all of this. But the idea that they don't have a future politics just seemed to me to be entirely at odds with this. The embarrassment for the American left is that faced with the same dilemma when it came to the Green New Deal, the answer of the Biden people was there's no way we can put the president on TV to say something like, right now you need to have a car that consumes less petrol, you can't be driving your truck anymore. This was untouchable. Even at the levels of details of policy, we couldn't do carbon taxes in the US because it was unthinkable to ask people to actually curb their gas consumption, right? And there we have Trump out there in front saying this. So I, again, took this to be a shielding reaction where basically the left was somehow projecting onto Trump problems in their own politics, which they couldn't really come to terms with. And that, I think, stands up. Of course, the problem is that Trump's politics is a huge bundle of it's a huge bundle of different themes. And so this is only one strand. And I'm not going to deny that there are some end times people who may really be thinking these kinds of, pessimistic fascism, that may really be their bag. But I don't think it doesn't. And it's a real problem for the left if we think that will be a helpful way of diagnosing this.
I mean, in a certain sense, related to this, I mean, the question of the future, there seems to be at least an implicit future agenda when it comes to educational politics. I mean, you're at Columbia, and one of the universities critically targeted by the Trump administration for, well, what is rendered as their too lax handling of certain political actions and orientations and expressions. So one has that, right? I mean, the famous J.D. Vance, famous or infamous pronunciation or utterance at the university. I mean, the Nixon reference are the enemy or the locus of the enemy of the people, right? And the whole anti-EDI, anti-Vogue maneuvers, this level of enforced censorships in the name of free speech, however topsy-turvy these weird dialectics without sublation, or one gets a sublation, but it does nothing to the contradiction. It's just still a contradiction in a strange way. I mean, what is your read of this? What is your read of this? Which can seem, let's say, from the other side of the Atlantic, a bit like a direct attack on one of the ideological reproductive institutions that are absolutely crucial, namely the university and their potential emancipatory function, actually. How do you see what is going on, and what does that mean for the status and the role of the university right now in the present conjuncture in the US?
I mean, this has been obviously a matter of really thinking it on our feet in real time with colleagues in medias res, right? I mean, because Columbia has been at the center of all of this. It's been a very difficult place to work for the last couple of years. I mean, speaking to you folks, coming from a European background, I often say to my American colleagues, wake up, smell the coffee. This is the reality of the vast majority of people in academia the world over. You don't have to love the place you work. You don't have to approve of its administration. Most academics hate the university they work at. This is actually our structural condition in most places. But it comes as a shock to the Americans. It really does. Because I think there are three vectors which really define the history of the modern American university in the form that we know it. It's quite recent, right, compared to, I mean, there's a long tradition of university education in the US, but it was largely a college-based and liberal arts model, close to theology. It moves in the 20th century along, I think three lines that really matter and have all come into play in Columbia. And this is just my effort to historicize, and actually in quite a structural way. I mean, one is the role of the university in the Cold War was absolutely central. And this is the thing that's most bamboozling to us, right? Is that, well, who are you kidding? Universities are about the American military industrial complex first and foremost. Like, hey, wake up. This is what it's about. So that's number one assumption, it turns out. Also powerful reality. Big budgets, billions of dollars in research funding that hinge on this, right? And the next element is that the universities genuinely did become, always have been for women, because American higher education for women extended much deeper into the 19th century, but have also been, of course, real vectors for a kind of well, we could pejoratively say PMC liberalism, but we can also describe it as projects of liberation for an increasingly wide variety of people, of sexual experimentation, of the emancipation of black people, increasingly also of other minorities in American society. And they are at the forefront of that process. And it's in its own terms very real, but also contained to a social reality which doesn't exhibit massive social mobility. So what they are is this strange combination of extremely radical in their cultural politics, significantly shifted in their demography, and yet, on the other hand, demonstrably part of the reproduction of inequality in the United States. There are a few places in the world where it matters more. China would be another case, and Korea, where it may really, which university to go to is decisive. And then the third element is the globalization of American universities, which is key for Columbia. Like, 1 million foreign students studying in the US, 30% plus of our student body is foreign. And so we're entangled with global politics. The Middle East is not a long way away. This is a reality that is present on campus through the city that we're in and through international mobility. The other big shoe to drop still is the Chinese presence. Over 20% of our students are Chinese, mainland Chinese, that is. And so these are these kind of difficult realities that we're dealing with. And the radicalism of our current moment, this is another one of these moments where we have to have a prise de conscience, is that on the one hand, Vance clearly is a cultural warrior. And before him, people like Barr, who was Attorney General in the previous Trump administration, I mention him because he was active on Columbia campus during the Vietnam War. So there is a tradition of rabid, full-blown conservative backlash in the US. There is really a culture war. And that's part of the unhinging here, and it's deliberate, and they really do intend, and they want to do this tactics of demonstrating. They want to create, as they say, fear. They actually want to intimidate and destroy certain complacencies. The other thing, which is the radicalism we really have to encompass, which is the Musk phenomenon, is a foundational, bottom-up critique of that science complex. For them, the ultimate liberal myth is that big world-changing science has to be done through government-funded universities. This is the Californian myth of the 50s and 60s, and the new generation of Californian innovators don't think that's correct. They don't think that university funding is the central route to go. They're fundamentally privatizing the production of knowledge and innovation, and it is Musk's, not the Tesla, but SpaceX that really demonstrates this. If you can go into space essentially driven by a private project, then all bets are off, right? Like, you can, Mazzucati can try as hard as she like to demonstrate that ultimately the patents come from somewhere else, but they're not buying it. They don't buy this story. The pattern of R&D spending since the 80s is so they see that argument and answer it. And unless we recognize this, endlessly saying, "Oh well, don't you understand?" They fully understand our position and just simply reject it. And the third element that has come together in the Columbia case is that, of course, we are at the crossroads in New York of the entanglement of the United States with the politics of the Middle East since the foundation of Israel in the 1940s, right? And it's just a reality that bites in our town, on our university, but not just on ours by any means, in a way that is incredibly direct because of the significance of Columbia as a center of Jewish learning, the significance of New York as a center of Zionist mobilization. And this really is the space, I think, where a Hawleyan analysis really comes home, because as I was saying earlier on, read Policing a Crisis and substitute anti-Semitism for mugging, and you have the text for understanding the dynamics of the panic that has been unleashed, the moral panic that's been unleashed, the strategies of escalation. His spiral of escalation map applies directly to our circumstance, in which individual cases are taken as representative of larger themes, which are then turned into matters of emergency. And that is the space that we find ourselves in. And the strategies within this right now are humble. They're strategies of survival, of continuity, of pastoral care for colleagues and care for other students. But I mean, it's no secret, it's all over Twitter. I'm on like 2 of the watch lists. There was a minor campaign to have me deported just before I got my citizenship. So this, and it's not the circumstance I ever imagined to find myself in. But I mean, it's this engagement is it sucks you into a configuration of power that that I think we have to understand, and this goes back perhaps also to the polycrisis term. The polycrisis term for me is not a diagnosis of immediate collapse. So I'm not expecting, in old SPD terms, like große Kladderadatsch, the big bang where everything is going to fall down and the world ends. Looking at America, any reasonable person looks at the place and go, this cannot last. Like, this cannot go on. Like, it's bound to fall. Like, this, you cannot. Like, this, and yet it does, right? And so this is the reality that I think we also need to understand and live with. And this is one of the mistakes, I think, also in a certain catastrophist, climate politics, that is always waiting for the big bang that's going to shift parameters. And and the remarkable thing at being at Columbia is we've kind of had the worst case in some ways. And life continues. And so then the challenge really is to shape a progressive politics, a progressive pedagogy, a teaching, a mode of being with each other, which is one of the big challenges on campus, that continues in the face of these kind of disruptions. I mean, it's a microcosm, and it's a tiny, privileged, incredibly well upholstered microcosm of, the real nightmare that is unfolding it's an echo, a distant echo of the horror that's unfolding in Gaza and in so many other places around the world.
So we always end our conversation with a series or either or questions. Yes. So you can either reject the choice, elaborate on it, but you don't have to.
Oh, this is this thing you do, isn't it? Yeah.
Yes. Okay. So shall we begin?
Yeah, go for it.
All right. So Wilson or Lenin?
Oh, this is one I reject. I'm a Lloyd George or a Clemenceau guy, like slandered by Keynes, the two of them. To my mind, great radical liberals. Clemenceau, a great warrior in the American Civil War of the 1860s. I go to the radical liberal side there, the new liberalism of that era.
All right. So the second one, Latour or Beck?
Yeah, this is harder than you might expect. It's like the smart theory answer is clear, but I grew up with Beck. Like, Beck is like one of my first Surkamp books. And the Risk Society book still has this bold interpretive vision that I found very compelling during the crisis. But in the end, it's one step short of where we need to move, right? Because the ultimate kind of standard German, here's historical social theory, and I'm going to explain the world in one set of concepts, remains. And that for me is it's one card short of the full deck. And I do in the end find that much more in Bruno's work. Yeah.
Keynes or Polanyi?
Keynes. I have a hard time disentangling my own identity from that figure. So Polanyi, I teach. It's extraordinary. The presence of Polanyi in the current world is a remarkable phenomenon. Essential for teaching, as I discovered again this term as well. But no, in the end, in part because of Keynes' engagement, like that's what to my mind makes him a really critical figure. I've long thought that in the kind of pantheon of my great friend Stefan Eich is writing the book about Keynes's political theory we really need, because if you're looking for an answer to Carl Schmitt from the liberalism side of liberalism, Keynes is really the answer to my mind to Schmitt's critique of modern liberalism, and that's so deeply misunderstood. Typical, for instance, in Moyne's recent survey of liberalism and its problems, Keynes doesn't even appear, and yet, to my mind, he is the person that gives us some of the tools that we would need to face that critique from the right, and by that extension, also Lenin, obviously, because like Schmitt and Lenin have so much in common in their critique of liberalism.
Gramsci or Althusser?
I'm going to dodge this. I'm going to go Merleau-Ponty.
Okay.
It's a silly answer, but yeah.
The next one, Obama or Biden?
Obama. On foreign policy, like I just see in retrospect, and it's been tough to come to terms with, but I'm just so much a 90s I can't escape my own formation in the 90s, and the slapdash way in which the Biden people just overturn some of the fundamental logics that in economic policy I find utterly uncompelling. And the Obama administration people, to my mind, were the first American realists in terms of power. You do begin to see in them a recognition of the multipolar world and America's relative weakness within it that was absolutely missing in the Biden team. So yeah, kind of odd retrospective sympathy for Obama.
Structuralism or existentialism?
Existentialism, yeah. I mean, nothing else would make any sense given my, but absolutely, yeah. No, it's a, yeah.
Classical or pop and rock music?
Jazz.
Jazz. Okay. So we have three more. Thrillers or comedies?
Thrillers.
This is very important for Frank and I. Batman or Superman?
I couldn't. It's really this. I don't like. I was going to say Action Man, who's like this toy soldier military figure. But well, in fact, if I had to choose, clearly Batman's cooler. I don't know whose feelings I'm hurting, but like he's like that's a cool franchise. The Superman thing, I can't really get with.
We were toying with the idea of doing an issue of Christ and Critique Journal about Batman and Superman. So I don't know.
It's two different dark visions of. Yeah, it's a good idea.
Yeah, because Superman is like the Man of Steel. The reference is very, very clear. So, so the very last one, Adam, Bruce Springsteen or Taylor Swift?
Springs. I mean, too much. Springsteen. Yeah.
Thank you so much for this.
Thank you so much.
Fantastic.
It was truly great.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Great talking to you guys. Thank you so much for what you do. I really, really appreciate it.